to another Theology Podcast, and we're glad to have you with us. We have a great show in store for you today. In case you're wondering who I am C.R. Wiley, and I am a pastor now living in Washington State. And that may be news to you if this is a podcast you've listened to before and have associated me with Connecticut. Anyway, I'm living in Washington State now, even though at the moment I'm sitting in a booth in a brew pub kind of restaurant thingy here in Connecticut. So I'm still
in Connecticut. The first podcaster to learn how to bilocate.
That's it. That's me. That's me. I exist in two places at once. But I've written some books, and hopefully by the time this show comes out, my book on Tom Bombadil will be available to people who want to buy it. But enough about me. So Glenn, tell us about your bearded and braided bearded self.
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a professor of history at Central Connecticut State University, senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and I do a few other things as well, though I don't braid my beard. My wife does that for me.
That's right. Well, that's what a wife is for. Every dwarf needs a wife to braid his beard. But anyway, Tom.
Hey, look, I'm not that short.
I don't have the Gimli look going, but I wish I did.
Yeah, that's right. Right. So, Tom, tell us about yourself.
Tom Price, systematic theologian, Christian ethicist. I teach both at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and other places. And, I don't have the beard that Glenn does, though I wrestle with envy, so I have to...
That's right, we're going to talk about René Girard today.
That's right. And so, but I'm going to start the topic today. Might as well roll right in.
It's your day.
I got a question. I'm not going to read the name of the person, but they'll be glad that I brought their question out there. Is they're kind of seeing a lot of the things we've been talking about for a long time take shape. And they sort of said, I'm just trying to make sense of how it is possible for the whole world to lose its mind at once. Or some provisional thoughts. What is your understanding of how so many people can go so mad simultaneously?
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, I think behind the question is, or another way of putting it is when we see a lot of the challenges that the church is facing currently, and maybe even our country or culture, why is it that so many people have jumped on board with stuff that is so diametrically opposed to reality as we've understood it for so long?
Right.
And how can people just run with it and cave to it in ways that if you had some purchase on reality, in any deep sense of the word, you just wouldn't typically cave to or run with.
Right.
And I thought it was an excellent enough question to kind of just throw out and tie together some themes we've been doing for a long time. I'm not going to dominate this with any particular work or insight. I thought it was a good question to kind of just throw out for us, draw off of what we've done before, new insights, and then I'm going to tie in a little bit of it to a book I'm reading, Paul Griffith's excellent work called Lying, an Augustinian Theology of Duplicity. So,
well, I think that's a great thing to tie into this, but I want to bring out at least one thing that I hear in the question to make sure that we deal with. Lying has been with us from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm hearing this guy say is, ask is, what's going on that brings us to this point where things kind of have gone crazy? In other words, we've been in a world where lying is something that is going on all the time. Mm-hmm. But we can all remember a past in which things didn't seem to be at the place it is now. They are now.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is not the first time, even within the last 100 or 200 or 300 years, where we've gotten to this kind of, I think, nadir or zenith, however you want to put it, in terms of social unrest, crisis. Here we are sitting in a restaurant. It's not as though bombs are going off in the parking lot. It's not as though...
Not yet.
Yeah, but that's the point. Not yet. I think there's a sort of uneasiness that we all feel that this question is getting at, and the uneasiness is we all know that taking this to another level in terms of violence would be really bad, even insane. Mm-hmm. But we see that it could happen. We suspect that it could happen. Mm-hmm. Not just because of things that we see people doing who aren't like us, but feelings that we have ourselves that we are trying to control
Yeah.
that we don't want to get out of control. In other words, we could become what we are, fearing.
That's right. And I think there's with it this notion that, not everyone, of course, there's generations that haven't been tied to the experience of previous social evils, but for people, and I imagine the guy in the audience who wrote this is, of a similar, generation to where, how do we know when there's been so much world experience of what follows from the kind of trends that we're seeing?
Right.
That we're going to naively just start running with it and not passionately put a spoke in its wheel.
Right.
I mean, I think that's sort of the...
And how do you put the spoke in the wheel?
In the wheel,
Do you put the spoke in the wheel by striking first? It doesn't seem to me to be the way to go.
That's right, and that's right.
I think a lot of this revolves around the idea that we no longer live in a shared world.
Yeah.
We talked in our last episode, we talked about a breakdown in metaphysics. I think we're also seeing now a breakdown in epistemology.
Yeah.
That people have looked at the fruit of modernity and decided that they didn't want a lot of it.
Yeah.
I mean, and who can blame them? We've got nuclear weapons, we've got biological warfare, we've got all kinds of horrors that have come from the application of science.
Yeah, and tied to that, I mean, and this is why I think sometimes discernment is rigorous for Christians at this point, because a lot of times Christians find themselves in desperation defending the Enlightenment
right,
when they don't realize they were thrown to the very margins, even though they've been made the kind of symbolic straw man. And notice I didn't say straw person. Straw man in this. They've been made the straw man of sort of what needs to be demonized as the central power of things. But actually Christianity was not the driving force of the Enlightenment. It was actually very, very marginalized and ultimately was going to be undermined by it. And so what you have here is a lot of Christians just desperate to save the phenomena of a world and order they knew, trying to kind of raise arms, if you will, to defend something that Christianity itself had been criticizing much longer than critical theory or anything else.
Right. Yeah, this brings up something that I'd like to introduce at this point. I know you've got the theme of lying that you wanted to get into.
We can
tie
it in.
We can roll with it.
Just run.
Yeah. I'm reading René Girard right now, and I'm reading the book that people more or less say is the book to read when it comes to getting introduced to his thought, and that is I Saw Satan Fall Like Lightning, which is, of course, a reference to something that Jesus said when the 70 returned after, going, 2 by 2 throughout the region that surrounded them and reporting back to Christ on what had occurred in terms of demons being cast out, and the gospel being proclaimed, so forth. Anyway, what Girard does is get at a spiritual reality that underlies human societies, not just modern ones, but just human societies, period. And he begins his analysis with a set of reflections on the Ten Commandments and the last commandment, not to covet. And his analysis is essentially that, you've got kind of a chiastic structure with the Ten Commandments in the sense that, at either end, you've got something tremendously important. You've got at the top, have no other gods, and so forth. And then at the very bottom, addressing the subject of desire, which is the sort of wellspring for the sins against your brothers and sisters that are enumerated up right above them, right above that. So it's, I remember reading the Ten Commandments when I was younger and thinking, oh, they just threw in that one to make it 10, It's, what's the big deal about, coveting, what's the big deal about envy in general and so forth. Well, what Girard gets at is that what you have in this commandment, this prohibition with regard to coveting, is really kind of the very thing that is the problem at a social level, societal level, that leads to all the other stuff that is described there or is condemned and prohibited. Now, he gets into something, mimesis, which is something that's not an idea that he's responsible for introducing. It's something that many thinkers have noted with regard to human nature. And by the way, it's a very biblical idea in the sense that we are image bearers.
Yeah.
Question is are we going to bear the image of the things that we make, or are we going to bear the image of the maker that made us? That's the difference between the idolatry and true worship. If we worship the one true God, then we bear his image.
That's right.
We're his image bearers. Whereas if we worship the works of our hands, the things that we've made, we're idolaters.
Yep.
And in the process, we're distorted, we're twisted, and so forth.
The loves get off-centered, the relations get...
That's right.
Now, all the social issues and problems start to develop.
So when this image bearing goes awry, what do we end up looking at? We look at each other, for one thing, and as we look at each other, we notice that, well, some people have more things than we have.
Yeah.
And they've got more power, they've got more prestige, they've got more stuff, they've got more pleasure, they've got better looks, what have you. So, but
they got more privilege.
That's right, more privilege. So there's this sense that we end up orienting ourselves toward these people. And through mimetic desire, we desire the things that they possess. And ironically, the very fact that we desire the things that they possess causes them to hold on to them jealously. And you've probably witnessed this even with your own self, that maybe there's something that you possess that you just haven't thought about for years, and you don't even care about it all that much anymore. But somebody else expresses an interest in it. Next thing you know, you're possessive. That's mine. Yeah. You can't have that. That's my thing.
Yeah.
And
and sometimes there's this notion. I mean, you don't. A lot of times you're just. You have certain endowments, and you have certain abilities and gifts, and you just exercise them. You don't think a whole lot more about them.
Yeah.
And yet they enter this world of conflict.
Well, that's the thing.
Yeah.
You can't help but be either an object of envy, or someone who is jealous for the things that you possess. So in other words, this is the situation we find ourselves in. Now, what this leads to, according to Girard, and I think this is a tremendously biblical insight, is scandal.
Yeah.
So when we think about scandalon, and we think about the word scandal, the word scandal is used in a way in the New Testament that is not really in keeping with the, I think, conventional way or the common, or sort of the way we think about it. So like when you say there's been a scandal, usually what we mean to say when we say there's been a scandal is something horrible happened, probably had something to have to do with money or sex, and now it's out in the news and everyone is scandalized. But that's not the meaning of the word scandal or scandalon in the Greek. In the Greek, it means to trip up, stumble,
trip over,
to trip over. So to scandalize somebody is to make them trip.
Yeah.
So what you have with the New Testament insight is that a scandalizer is a person who causes other people to trip.
Yeah.
So why would you talk about somebody in a way that's derogatory? Well, you would talk about them in a way that's derogatory in order to make them trip, so that you can overtake them and you can acquire the thing that they possess. So in a society in which scandals multiply, where you have more and more scandalous behavior, meaning people at each other's throats, essentially. We're talking about, Cain and Abel stuff here. When you lose sight of your brotherhood, when you lose sight, and this is why, and this is something that Girard talks about, and he talks about Jesus, who says, you should imitate me. It's intended to subvert the process of imitating those that we desire to be like but have to harm in order to acquire what they possess. So a society can reach such a point of destructive, mimetic desire, to use this term, or envy, or covetousness, that it really does threaten to break down. That you need the scapegoat, someone that everyone can rally around, hating, in order to provide the kind of unity that you need to. And then this is where Girard talks about is Satan casting out Satan.
Yeah.
So he says this is a situation in which Satan wins either way you go.
Yeah.
And so anyway, that's the background. That's the backdrop. And what it helps to explain is insanity. The insanity that we're talking about at times like this.
That's right.
Where, it's been observed by different people that poor societies are not revolutionary societies.
Yeah.
Societies in which differences are diminishing, where living conditions are rising and standards are rising. Those are the cultures in which you're more likely to experience revolutionary fervor.
Yeah.
So, people who are just used to sort of kind of getting by, just trying to survive.
Yeah.
They're not charging the barricades.
Yeah.
It's the children of those people whose standards of living have gone up over, and it's created, sort of great expectations. To use that phrase.
That's right.
And so anyway. But what the satisfying thing about this, in terms of my reading of it, is for one thing, it helped me to see something I puzzled about for a long time, because I knew that's what the word scandal meant in Greek, and I just couldn't reconcile it to the way we use the word in English. Scandals are things, of course, that we hear about, but what causes a scandal to spread?
Yeah.
Why do we feed on this stuff? Why do we delight in seeing other people harmed or come to naught?
Yeah.
In other words, there's a kind of glee that we see at work here. And we say, they finally got what they had coming to them.
It's interestingly sinister, but I think this is something that sinister forces tap into. You think about thinking about our particular culture in particular, the way we see the current dynamic is you have a very wealthy, elitist global class dominating and pretty much could change the conditions of the world for the better for everyone underneath it. But what they do instead is they motivate the marginalized psychologically, in particular, and somewhat socioeconomically. Who they could have been helping for years, but they haven't. But what they do is they create a straw man scapegoat, white supremacy, the plumber who works hard all day but votes for Trump. And they make an evil demon out of this figure, and everyone runs and attacks that person rather than the actual game players that have the capacity.
Well, there's actually a way to explain that, and the explanation is...
That's what I think this guy's question is on to,
the way to explain that is that the uber elite are not threatened at all by the underclass. What they're threatened by is the middle class.
That's right.
The middle class is the party that is the party that they don't want to sort of be reabsorbed into. But and they don't want to identify with. We see this with Caesar and the plebes against the patricians. There are many different examples historically that we can point to.
What's interesting in this, I think, maybe taps into that guy's question is why is it that the elites can tap into this Girard point that you need to create a scapegoat and a demonized.
But the thing is, I think Girard can be applied the other way as well, because I think that. What he's getting at is not so much justice as envy, and that everyone is either everyone is trying to satisfy some kind of covetous sort of impulse, whether we're talking about the uber elites and their need to control everything, the middle class and the desire to rise. There are these different phenomena, and I don't have this all sort of charted out, but I think that his insight in terms of kind of this kind of being irrational, in other words, sort of defying logic, reason, even self-interest. In other words, we've all seen people who've even harmed themselves in order to harm another. There's that great, I think, Yiddish story where a guy, envies his neighbor, and an angel appears to him and says, I will give you anything you ask for on one condition, that your neighbor that you hate, that you envy, gets twice as much. And so without hesitation, the envious man says, make him blind in one eye, or make me blind in one eye. Make me blind in one eye so he can be blind in two eyes. He gets twice as much.
Yeah.
In other words, we have we are willing to be harmed if we believe that the one we envy will be harmed more. So when we think about riots, or we think about social unrest, or these different things, we can talk about, I remember the Rodney King riots in the early 90s in Los Angeles. You remember those, right? And I remember, the fact that many of the businesses and buildings that were burnt to the ground were owned by black people. So black rioters would burn down these buildings. And I remember there was this tearful scene that was on national television on the news, where there was this black entrepreneur who was weeping in the streets because his business had been burnt to the ground, and he just kept asking, why? I'm one of you. Yeah. Why did you burn my business to the ground? Yeah. And, for one thing, I don't imagine that the rioters were looking for, documentation on who owned what. It's just, here's an example of somebody that has something that I don't have, and I'm going to harm that person. But the very fact that they wouldn't think about something like that says something.
Well, but I think that was my point a little bit earlier, is that what you're able to create through even propaganda and other means is this, what you're already tapping into, a sort of resentment, and then you exacerbate it by creating a kind of monster figure, a straw man group. And so they become the target of everything you envy and everything you hate and everything else. There is this tapping into all of these raw, fallen states, if you will, dispositions, malformed loves, idolatries. And then there is this increasingly intensified centering of it on a group or a figure or a symbol that becomes the object that has to be removed in order for you to reach, the sacrifice, the lamb, that if you can just get rid of it, somehow you're going to reach that saving point.
I think evidently, in our recent history, it's Trump for a certain group of people.
Well, that's
for certain groups of people, it was Trump.
Yeah.
For other groups of people, it's another party. But that's the point at which our society is more kind of in a civil war state than in terms of a total revolutionary state.
It is, but Trump's a great kind of symbol point. What is it about a kind of liberal Enlightenment playboy from New York City that has become the central scapegoat, if you will, the one that I'm talking at the other angle,
sure,
the one they're latching on, the demonization of the symbol to represent everything reprehensible that people need to destroy. When actually, here is a person who's completely just proved in his presidency how impotent someone who is elected to office actually is. He doesn't wield the power they all say he does. He has a symbolic power.
Right.
He doesn't. And what is it about this attractiveness to symbolic power that is unhinging those that actually have the real power?
Right. Well, yeah, I think that you have, in that instance, jealousy. Sometimes people confuse jealousy and envy. Jealousy can be legitimate. God is a jealous God, because he has a right to what is his, meaning his people and so forth. A jealous husband, a jealous wife. These people have rights that are being threatened. Envy, though, doesn't seem to be a thing that ever can be justified. Can you think of an instance when it can be justified?
It might help if we define terms here.
Okay.
In the classic definitions in the 7 deadly sins, pride and envy are flip sides of the same coin, basically. Mm-hmm. Pride means the desire, the Latin word is superbia.
Right.
And you can see in the root there the idea that you are ahead of everybody. You are, that's it. You're number one. Mm-hmm. Envy is the opposite of that. Envy is where it's the desire to tear down or to destroy anyone who is in front of you.
And that's what scandal is.
Yeah.
When we use the Greek, to scandalize is to take someone down. Now, it's always great when you have something that is really true that you can work with.
Yeah, that's right. Something that should be taken down.
But here's another thing that we need to think about in the larger question of why is the world so crazy right now? Why do we have this massive cultural or actually worldwide psychosis?
Yeah.
What is... How would you define insanity? I think a reasonable definition of insanity would be something along the lines of seeing the world or believing things about the world that simply aren't true, that do not in any way comport with reality.
Yeah.
Here's the problem. With the breakdown of the Enlightenment consensus, with the breakdown of modernity in a lot of ways, and the rise of critical theory and so on as part of that, there's a thing called standpoint theory that develops. And standpoint theory basically says that there is no objectivity in the world. There's no way of being objective. There may not even be an objective world out there.
And that is an objectively true viewpoint, anyway, for those in standpoint.
Yes. So since you cannot get access to the world objectively, everything is a matter of your standpoint, matter of your viewpoint. We would say worldview, perhaps.
Yes, sir.
So everything about the world is filtered through your worldview. Now, the other assumption of this is that since there is nothing objective out there, one standpoint is basically as good as any other.
Yeah.
Which means that things like science, that's okay as one standpoint, done typically by dead white males,
or living white males,
white males. But that's just one standpoint, and it's no more or less true than the standpoint of someone who rejects everything that science says.
And this is, I always tell people, the same figure asked me why, if I would go back in history and kill any figure I could, it would be Hegel. Hegel was one of the big instigators of this. He's not
you could room with Schopenhauer.
Yeah. Sadly, I probably get along with Schopenhauer a bit more than Hegel.
Rousseau.
Rousseau. Well, yeah, definitely. But Hegel, again, I probably love and hate him, one of those kind of figures. But this very thing, back to Thales, right? You don't have being, and then you don't have the law of identity between anything. Which what do I mean by that? That you can't locate anything's genuine identity. It's in flux. It's becoming.
Right.
All reality is becoming. And so because of that, everything is fluid. And because everything is fluid, there is no point at which any one particular identity viewpoint has a capture on reality. It's all the standpoints of anyone who has consciousness, because they are all manifestations of reality trying to realize itself, or God trying to realize itself. So what do you have is viewpoints. Historical perspectivalism is another word of putting it. Everything is okay, in this particular history, you understand it in its context, that's reality. But there isn't any truth there. It's what was Lessing's favorite thing. You cannot derive from the particularities of history any universal notion of truth. That was his big thing, which was hugely Kantian, but hugely indebted to this whole dynamic view of reality, which I think ushered in with post-Enlightenment thinkers. And so, yes, you've created relativism, you've created perspectivalism. You've created this whole notion that my tribe, my narrative, my story is what's important, everything else. I see it in the seminaries, and now it's celebration of my cultural identity and its interpretation of, the Bible rather than any connection to
that's a
tradition.
Very short step to everything that we have rejected in evangelicalism.
That's right.
For my lifetime anyway.
And in classic, lowercase Catholic Christianity, Catholic intellectual tradition, Orthodox Christianity, from the start rejected it.
Right.
We had this notion of, here's one. Let's just go back to Scripture, okay? Let's think of the Tower of Babel, right? we have the curse on humanity for coming together to develop a unified culture, vision, reason, whatever, to develop a tower to God, right? Confusion of the language. Well, what you have in the book of Acts, I'm very convinced, is a reversal of that.
Oh, sure.
But do you note, and I always think this is very phenomenal, do you note that in Pentecost, tongues, everyone hears the same truth in their own language?
Yes, that's it. That's right.
So you have the same truth as a governing larger cultural, linguistic context in which all the others are incorporated, we shouldn't reject,
Right.
but they are also centered in, grounded in the one that is shared. That is what I think is the original Catholic, lowercase Catholic, universal vision of the church.
Right.
And I think that's very different. So what I can say is that I don't need to pivot a group against, and I understand they're celebrating the fact that Enlightenment crushed them out of the picture. Don't blame it on Christianity. Christianity did get reinterpreted in the Enlightenment. Enlightenment Christianity is not historic Christianity. It may have found a form that did offer a genuine witness in it, but the Christianity far precedes the Enlightenment.
Right. Sure.
And so I think that Enlightenment synthesis and the attempt to make Christianity a part of that synthesis is something we don't need to defend. We can show how Christianity had everything that was good of the Enlightenment, and also everything it should have rejected everything that was bad about it, because it wasn't something that was it grounded rationality and all those things that held a unity in the human subject rather than in the divine subject, which was the source of everything.
Which in my mind raises a challenge, or so if Christianity capitulated during the Enlightenment era to certain standards of sort of proof and so forth, if that was the case, are we seeing kind of the record again, sort of like we're on repeat? We're just doing it again, but now there's in other words, our leading lights are actually people with their fingers to the wind. They're saying, okay, what's going on here? What do we need to accommodate? What do we need to adapt ourselves to? And I think one of the things that has been most disconcerting for many of the people I know who are conservative by disposition is how they feel betrayed by certain public intellectuals within Christianity, who they thought were trustworthy, and now they can tell are sort of wiggling in the wind, trying to find a way to sort of make everybody happy. In other words, they're kind of the Me Too crowd. They're like, I mean, we Christians, we're there with you. We're there with you on that one. We're there with you on that one. We're there with you on that one. And what these people are at least wanting to see is some kind of principled stand that's willing to take a hit.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Are any of these people really willing to take it on the chin?
Yeah. And Glenn, you had a point. I mean, I think what you have going on is this, I think, this lack of discernment that is very characteristic. I guess this gets back to this guy's question. Why are those figures that symbolically have, elite prestige within evangelicalism, for example, why is their antenna their kind of activity driven in such a direction that it goes completely with the flow of the mood of culture, and
particularly, the elites of culture.
Right. That's right. The elites of culture, who, the driving engine, if you will, of kind of a lot of the.
I think I've got part of an answer to this.
Okay.
In the early 20th century, the predecessors to the evangelicals were known as fundamentalists. The word's kind of shifted in meaning a bit over the decades. Yeah. But they basically lost out in the culture war at that point, and they said, well, we're going to take all our marbles and go home.
Yeah.
And so they ended up being really not a significant part of American Christianity, except in their own subculture, for decades. And as a matter of fact, even in the 1950s, which a lot of people seem to think of as the golden age of Christianity in America, it's the golden age of liberal Protestantism.
Yeah, right.
So what happens is in 1976, Time magazine declares it the year of the evangelical because they've come out of the woodwork. And, you've got, Billy Graham helped with a lot of this starting in the late 50s. It started moving evangelicalism into sort of public awareness. Then you get Jimmy Carter, a self-proclaimed evangelical elected president. You have Jerry Falwell and the rise of the moral majority, all of these kinds of things. And suddenly it became, if not completely at least certainly acceptable culturally to be an evangelical. And they were taking increasingly prominent places in society. And then the societal winds shifted. And they were not willing to let go of the power and influence that they had. And as a result, they started shifting with it.
And one of the things I noticed in the kind of seminary context is how much followers they were. I don't know if it's an episode of Providence or something else that made me not one of them. But I mean, having come through those angles, and even the strong historicist perspectival vision when they got at Duke and everything. I mean, I remember being at Oxford debating people, and I just remember for people, atheists, secularists, everything, even kind of liberal Christians and everything. I just remember, although on one end they were good scholars in the fields with whatever they were dealing with, they were hugely ignorant, metaphysically, ontologically, epistemologically. You could find some that could carry the game, but they really did not have a grasp, as most evangelicals don't, of really what's going on. I mean, I've been literally. I'm not talking, Ohio State. It's probably a great school. I just pulled it out of my head.
Sure.
But I'm talking. I've been in the circles in Oxford and everything else, and it's the same thing. A lot of times, they just were underinformed but overly confident with their position and prestige of what's going on. Now, I'm not saying everyone. I mean, you carry a figure like Oliver Donovan. This is a person who substantively knew what was going on and was also in the know of people who were in the know. But he was not trying to be relevant. I mean, someone who writes The Desire of the Nations in Resurrection and Moral Order is not someone who is, as he said, we can lose our confidence sometimes, and sometimes we need to regain it in that context. But he promoted those works in a context of people that were antagonistic and would have laughed at him, even though he had the better argument.
Yeah, and I think that this is where the long game comes into play. I think that there is truth has legs. In other words, it has a way of prevailing, but with time. So you may die and only know posthumous success. You know what I'm talking about? But your point earlier, Tom, about kind of discovering that the emperor has no clothes, if you know what I mean. I've experienced that in different settings. It helps when you don't grow up in a Christian home in certain respects. I find a lot of people who've grown up in evangelical homes have a kind of insecurity. They don't understand the weaknesses of. They're more or less impressed with all of the pyrotechnics of popular, culture and with status symbols and stuff like that. And consequently, they don't really look into their own tradition and unearth its riches. They instead try to find ways to be a part of the action, and the action seems to be always somewhere else. But what happens when things are in decline is that things speed up the closer you get to the drain. There's kind of and we live in a society where a lot of the action that catches our attention is really evidence of the social decay. And when you're trying to build something that has some future, it's fecund, it has potential to be fruitful for generations. Well, in the beginning, it can be rather unimpressive. It can be small, like a mustard seed. It can be something that no one's going to pay any attention to at the moment. So when we think about fundamentalism, why did fundamentalism become evangelicalism, and how did evangelicalism become the main line without being the main line? Well, I think in part because the main line failed, and it failed spectacularly. It gave up Christian distinctives like nobody's business, and it was willing to accommodate itself to anything that was late and great.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. There was this loss of confidence.
Yeah, and now I see evangelicalism following the same.
Yeah, I did an article called "Reinventing the Flat Tire" once, and it was about precisely this.
Yeah.
But I really do think that loss of confidence, which shouldn't be there. I think it's just because the bravado of the rhetorical bravado of the other side and the intimidation of its power complex. I mean, I think that's really it. It's the same thing we see with big tech and everything else trying to intimidate someone. That's really what it's been. I mean, if you get enough people institutionally to think you're an idiot if you hold things, you lose confidence, and you kind of say, okay, well, let me find this corner where you'll accept me.
Yeah.
Rather than be that, against the grain figure, to say, you know what, you're the idiots. I don't care if it's 100 or 200 or 300 of you. Until you answer this, I'm not going anywhere.
Well, this is one of the things about the evangelical elite that is distasteful to me. To me, they don't have the guts to go out and fight in that world for what they really want.
That's right.
And on the other hand, they don't have the guts to stand up for the world that they belong to.
Yeah.
So they try to find a middle ground.
Yeah.
They try to be as much of the world as they can be and hold on to the minimal amount of what defines an evangelical as an evangelical and still be able to call themselves such.
Yeah.
So in my mind, just make up your minds. If you want to be, an authority, in the secular academy, just do it.
Yeah.
Now there is a way for you to do it, by maybe making fun of your ancestors for forever, and that make that sort of you become the darling of the intellectual elite because you're the guy who tells tales, about those yahoos that you knew as a child. And there are a number of evangelicals who've taken that route. I knew Harvey Cox.
Yeah.
I have a suspicion. Now, Harvey was interesting. Harvey was, I liked Harvey, but he came out of the evangelical world, kind of turned his back on it, and he became kind of like, he's not exactly the way. The sort of person that I'm describing now. What I'm describing now is more. What's that guy that went to Moody and then he was a Bible scholar. He wrote,
Ehrman?
Yes.
Ehrman,
Yep. He's to me the epitome of what I'm describing. He's making his living making fun of the people who made his life possible.
Yeah.
That's basically...
And likewise off of very bad arguments and presuppositions that themselves are laughable if you're a very rational person. But anyway, we'll do that in another show.
but there also seems to be another way to kind of secure your place in the elite, and that is to be that guy who has influence in evangelicalism, but who has one foot in the Atlantic Monthly or the New York Times, or just knows a few people, and the people who are in those publications or in those places don't want to make you look bad because they think that you're the way that the people who are kind of behind you will be brought around or brought in to whatever they have in store for everybody. Yeah. So, and, I could spend time naming and describing, but I don't want to be guilty of the kind of mimesis that, Girard describes, But, I think that what we're dealing with is a kind of crisis of confidence.
Yeah.
Within evangelicalism. Our friend Aaron Wren has done a series of marvelous podcasts under his new podcast, The Masculinist, on the history of conservatism. And one of the things he's noted in that series on conservatism is how sort of sparse the influence of evangelicals has been in terms of intellectual conservatism. Most of the intellectuals in conservatism are Jewish or Catholic.
Yeah, yeah.
And knowing a few of those people myself, I can say he's right.
Yeah. And what is it that they're attuned to? They actually go beyond the particularities of their Bible verse to actually drawing out the larger ramifications of their theological vision.
Right.
And that's what they're able to do.
And it seems to me, if I can jump in,
that
is, I think, the fatal flaw of evangelicalism It's our tendency to be so biblicist that we think you have to have an exact proof text for pretty much everything, rather than taking the time to do the hard work of developing the implications of Scripture across the board that take you way beyond just the letter of the text.
Yeah, I that's right. And I think, I'm going to say it, and I don't mind losing whoever's going to be offended by it, but the biblicism that most evangelicals hold to today is not what the Reformation was interested in.
Amen.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, too, that some of the best commentary I've come across is coming from unexpected directions. So I just mentioned, René Girard's book.
Yeah.
He's given me some insight into some texts in the New Testament that I think he's right about. And I think that, how it is, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I think he does some things in his work that strikes me as being, that. He's trying to answer every question with just one answer. But there are some things that I think he's right on the money about. Yeah. And then right now I'm reading Leon Kass's commentary on Genesis, and I tell you what, I mean, there are things that are coming to the surface that I think he's right about, and these are things that. And it's not as though he's kind of sui generis. He's quoting rabbis from like the 12th century, and even the first century, bringing out sort of features of the stories that had been glossed over because of certain ways of handling the texts that are popular within evangelical circles.
And I think this is the right sense of Christian tradition, Christian intellectual history. Is its commentary work. And that's what I think the Reformers understood. That's what I think sometimes we got away from. When we think of tradition, we're thinking, Catholics hold to, St. Gregory Nazianzus as somebody who's infallible. No, first of all, they don't. But secondly, that's not what is being held. It's that St. Gregory was a reader of Scripture, and he's your brother in Christ. And so as such, you need to listen to him, because in Christ, who is resurrected, they're not dead. They're still living voices. Yep. And their living voice is teaching you something about yourself and about God that you don't know. It's not that they're infallible. It's just that they've been gifted as a teacher of the church to share with you something that they've read in Scripture that they're going to see that your gift doesn't have the capacity. Just like when we read together, Glenn's going to see stuff I don't see, you are. Right. But it's bigger than just us now. It's a whole living tradition that isn't infallible, but is a wisdom collection that we can read together. Okay, I may go with Nazianzus. I may have to say, I can't go with him, but he taught me something.
Well, that's, I think, the thing. I think that there's a tendency that people have in terms of the way they think about tradition to sort of acquiesce and just say, well, because he said it, it must be right.
That's right.
It just true confessions here.
Be careful.
I grew up Catholic, and one of the main things that I got from the Catholic Church was a firm belief that the Bible was the Word of God. I'd always been taught that, and I always accepted that. I never read it, but when I started reading it, I sort of became rather anti-Catholic. And moved into evangelicalism pretty firmly.
Right.
And when I was in college, I didn't take this is one of the examples of God's sense of humor. I didn't take a single church history course. The professor of church history was an Eastern Orthodox guy, but he was a real believer. Instead, I thought what I really needed wasn't church history, it was just Bible. So I took all the Bible courses that were offered at Michigan State. They were taught by a man who described himself as, and I quote, a 19th century liberal existentialist with Orthodox tendencies.
But he was teaching Bible.
Right.
In other words, he's a modern evangelical.
And I knew I was going into the lion's den with this guy, but he was gracious, and and I knew that there wasn't a lot that I was going to really benefit from this, but I was going to take the Bible classes because that's what a real Christian would do.
Right.
And of course, then I became a church historian.
That's right.
But the way I defend church history now to people like I used to be is asking the question, do you think God speaks to you through the Bible? And they are always, oh, yes, of course the God does.
Right.
Do you think God has been doing this through the centuries? Then why do you want him to repeat himself?
Yeah, that's a good argument. That's a good argument.
That's right.
I think one of the things that we're getting at a little bit, though, is how our personal stories can kind of prejudice us in certain ways. So, I don't come... my sort of family background is this weird thing, and I've gotten into it a little bit, described it a little bit. But I don't have any evangelical hang-ups, if you know what I mean. I wasn't raised in an evangelical home. My folks were Episcopalians, and the old joke, William Sloane Coffin's old joke. You remember William Sloane Coffin, Riverside Church in New York? He said, whether high or low, the status is always quo with the Episcopalians. So, the high church, low church.
We should do a whole show on Anglican jokes.
That's it. So that was my world. My grandfather owned a mink farm, of all things. My grandparents looked like the Howells on Gilligan's Island. Literally, I can show you a picture of them. But, so I come out of this weird world. I'm in this kind of bohemian environment as a child, beads and Buddhas all around me and incense and stuff like that. My parents got into all kinds of weird stuff, the Baha'is, Scientology, different things. So I come into a little evangelical church, blue-collar church, and I'm converted out of this completely wacky, sort of bohemian, sophisticated background. And the thing that attracted me to these blue-collar people was they were real. I mean, these were genuine Norman Rockwell people. These were the people that Norman Rockwell painted. These were just salt of the earth, likable folks with no pretension. And it was without any pretense that I get involved in this world, and I'm delighted that I've got something solid and people that I like. Now, sometimes it would frustrate me. There were attitudes, tastes, different things that I was sort of put off by.
You're like, Chris, shut down your Led Zeppelin. You're not allowed to play that.
Not even that. I could tell some stories. But there was a sense in which, even though I was grateful to them, I could see that the horizons were limited for those folks, and that I had seen some things that even as a child, I could see that they had not seen. Nevertheless, I thought they had something that I didn't have. I knew they had something I didn't have. And I've always felt somewhat appalled at their children for failing to see what was valuable in their parents, if you know what I'm getting at. So sometimes their children will put on airs of sophistication, pine away for being sophisticated and sort of influential people themselves, turn their back on not just the sort of the stuff that could be and should be turned away from, but even the good stuff, and throw the baby out with the bathwater, as the old saying goes. And that, I think, is what's going on in evangelicalism. I don't think evangelicalism's legacy in America is its intellectual sort of deposit. I think it's lived reality in local churches where really the grace of God has demonstrated itself in the salt of the earthness of the people.
Yeah.
I'm talking about blue-collar people, lower middle-class folks, people who are just doing their best to raise their kids in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord, and are honest and work hard. These are people I admire. And sometimes their children I don't admire so much.
Well, and I guess the guy's question is, kind of what has happened in such a way that so much of that world is just run with it, and there are a lot of answers to that. I mean, one is on the spiritual level, of course. How much of the current situation is the result of certain spiritual realities. Of course, they are there. Certain rejections of God, the consequences of that, the full vision of God, Christianity, its ethics, its vision, the embrace of alternatives have consequences. You set the cultivation conditions for people that no longer live in reality and aim for untruth. So So you have generations of that at this point. You have people very susceptible. This is my point with lying, that lying and truth become very hard to distinguish the difference of, and lying, it almost becomes utilitarian. If it achieves a certain goal, if you can lie to the public, as we hear every day pretty much in most media and politics, it's okay as long as it achieves their aim of the goal of what they conceive of a just society, which is an ideal, not a truth. And so, yeah, you've fertilized the ground, but I guess the real question he has there is, why has Christianity's influence become so little rather than so strong? And I think those are the things you guys are kind of hitting to. There's a lot of reasons, but I think one reason is the Christianity that we're getting most of the time isn't the Christianity that is Christianity. It's a soft version of it that's either therapeutic or kind of activist, but has really ripped itself from the thick intellectual spiritual tradition that it is anchored in, and because of that, its exhibition is very manipulatable and malleable.
Right.
It's something that is disconnected from its reality core, and because of that, a new reality vision can come and hijack it.
So what I'm hearing you say then, Tom, is that how can we expect the world to be in touch with reality when the church isn't in touch with it?
Yes. And it detached from reality. And evangelicals were susceptible because they dislodged themselves. My argument, they had the theology of redemption. They ripped it from the metaphysics of creation.
Yeah.
That would be my argument. And because of that, we're dealing with the Gnostic repercussions. And if the Christian metaphysic of creation isn't governing it, then redemption is being read in light of a different view of nature and reality.
Yeah, well, it's being add to that, it's not just a detachment from creation.
Yeah.
It is a kind of eschatology that says it's all going to burn.
Right.
Doing anything in this world is rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. This is where I think it's important for us to affirm the future of the created order in the new creation. In other words, there's something that is redeemed.
Continuity is essential, I think.
Yeah. And I think that Christ's resurrection isn't just a paradigm for our resurrection. I think it's a paradigm for the resurrection of the creation.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that Paul agrees with you. Yeah. I mean, the Apostle
Paul. That's right. And we become that first fruits, and therefore the creation is longing for us to become.
That's right. It's carried along on our coattails.
Yeah, that's right. and it is not transmogrified, but the language of kind of glorification or theosis in the Eastern traditions, when you're dealing with a creation that sees itself in light of what Christ in the Transfiguration manifested.
Well, let's bring this show to a close. Is there anything that you want to say, Glenn, as we wrap up?
I would. This didn't go the direction I'd expected it to go.
Right.
But what I would say is that I think that a significant part of the problem that the church is facing is the perennial problem in the church. It is that it becomes more like the world.
Yeah, and I think
and the more the church becomes like the world, the more corrupt it becomes. And somehow we have bought into the idea that we need to be popular, we need to be like the culture, we need to not turn off people, all of those kinds of things by taking a clear stand for truth. And the other part of this is that we have also forgotten our own tradition, so that we think that the only way to address the questions that the culture is asking is to buy into their answers.
Right.
So I think that both of these are just disastrous moves.
Yeah, let me just sort of wrap up with my thoughts, and then we'll let you give us the final word here, Tom, since it's your show. But my thought is that one of the ways that this is expressed practically within evangelicalism is with the church growth movement, particularly with the sort of the emphasis on marketing. Mm-hmm. Because the idea is that somehow we can separate the packaging from what's packaged, and we can wrap up the Christian sort of charisma in a way that's appealing to people who really, aren't shopping for Christian faith.
That's right.
So the idea is that if we sort of package it with this sort of progressivist gloss, well, that is the current strategy that some people have adopted. But if you go back 20 years in time, it was try to make the church look like, late night television, and you end up with, the guys out at Willow Creek, and stuff like that. It's sort of like whatever is sort of like the hip at the moment. We decide, okay, this is what the way we're going to dress things up, and the idea is that it's just clothing. It's not really us. We're just putting this show on. But it has a way of shaping us in ways that we're not even, sort of thinking about.
That's right.
How you dress does have a way of changing the way you think.
You do know that right now they're playing Sharp Dressed Man.
So ZZ
we love
Top.
some ZZ Top.
And you've got the beard, Glenn. And you recognized it.
From the first notes.
And I know when I actually came in, I had to run to the loo, as they say in England, and they were playing Tuesday's Gone with the Wind by Leonard Skinner in Connecticut. So I thought this was a weird day indeed.
That's it.
So I was going to wrap up with, one question is, the short answer to why is the world mad? Because, well, of course, it's so severed now from its attachment to any kind of realism or reality that it's very manipulatable. There's a spiritual side to that. We know scripturally, but concomitant to, or at least a corollary of it is the fact that, people are not centered in anything that is solid enough to be able to bear reality. And so therefore, they're able to be manipulated by that which appeals to what is foremost to people, their emotions, their experience, their psychology, those kind of, I think, psychological conditioning more than anything now. I really think I was going with Kantian, man, but I do think it's, not maybe Freudian's a little outdated, but it's definitely the psychological conditioned behavior, maybe a form of behaviorism. It drives the church and everything else in it. But yeah, definitely when it comes to the church, its God-centered origins and ends have to be retrieved. Otherwise, we don't have anything. We have nothing.
Yeah, you mentioned, behaviorism. It got me thinking of B.F. Skinner. Beyond Freedom and Dignity was his last major work. Think about that.
Yeah.
We're beyond that now.
Yeah.
Anyway, we appreciate your interest in the Theology Podcast. We appreciate it especially when folks give us a good rating on some platform, whether it's iTunes or Anchor or whatever you listen to us on. And we also appreciate all the folks, and there are a number of them, who give to us on a regular basis to help us defray the costs of the show. So thank you for your gifts.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's enough for now. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.